Thank you all for joining us this evening, and this is part of our Foodways grant that we got, and we're excited to learn all the different ways that Florida has evolved with food as well as just in general, how food is ingrained into culture and how everything goes. So we're here to learn from Latino Orlando to International Memphis, Foodways, Migration, and Transformation. We have Dr. Simone. Go ahead and take it over. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Really happy to have you all join me. And today what I want to do is talk about the significance of food, but in particular, the significance of food in certain Latino concentrated communities and other international communities. I've been interested in the study of migration for some time now, but I didn't always have an interest in foodways, aside from the consumption of food. Okay. And when I say foodways, what I mean by that is the study of food as culture. Okay. So that encompasses everything from looking at the production and consumption of food to the connections between food and identity, for instance, or the connections between food and places. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what I want to talk about and kind of outline so you know where I'm going, I wanted to start with just some background and context so you get a better understanding of how I came to realize the significance of food and the multiple meanings of food from dissent, okay, to celebration and unity. So I want to talk a little bit again about background and context, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my own family's history and my interest in identity as part of my journey to understanding food. Okay. And then I want to give you some specific examples from my documentary research and ethnographic research. I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, so I spent about 2 years doing field work in Orlando, Florida, and I never intended to do anything on foodways. But as I studied and documented the Latinization of the area, I spent most of my time in a suburb called Buenaventura Lakes in Osceola County. Some of you might be familiar with that area. But while I was there, I started to realize the significance of food for the community, okay, for the Latinization, for the place identity in that suburban subdivision. And I also realized how food led to dissent, okay, and how it told me a lot about the reaction to changing demographics in Orlando, okay. And then the last thing I want to do is give you a comparative case study. Okay, my most recent research, what I'm doing now in terms of documentary projects and book writing, is looking at foodways in Memphis. And there, I've been amazed that it's been such a completely different type of story, and food has just had a different place in the international community. So I want us to think a little bit more broadly about foodways and what food might mean to you, okay, in terms of your identity, in terms of your connection to region or to place, okay? Okay, so as I mentioned, my interest in studying migration goes back, okay, although my interest in foodways is relatively new in the last decade or so. But here you're seeing a photograph of my grandfather, okay, and in October of 1931, he received this letter from the New York and Puerto Rico Steamship Company. His name was Eusebio Delermi, and this was to confirm his second class passage aboard the Cuomo. And at the age of 24, he was planning to migrate to New York City from Vieques, which is an island municipality off the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. Okay, so he planned to move to New York, and he ultimately settled in East Harlem, or what some people in the community referred to as El Barrio, or Spanish Harlem. And he went on to eventually open a bodega or a grocery store. It was a small market. I'll tell you that he had 11 children and they never went hungry as a result of his business, okay, in food, in the food industry. So again, food was always important to my family in one aspect in terms of making a living and subsistence, okay, but also in terms of identity. Okay, in terms of Puerto Rican culture and preserving that and passing it down to the next generation. And me as part of even a third generation, okay, both of my parents were born in New York City, okay, food has been really important for my own cultural identity. Okay. So initially, my intentions were to look at the community in New York City, okay, that my family grew up in East Harlem. And I didn't have any intention on writing a book, Latino Orlando, about Florida and about Puerto Ricans and about foodways in Florida. But what happened is that while I was trying to do demographic data collection to understand population size in New York City, I realized, okay, a lot of the Puerto Ricans are moving outside of the community. Okay, East Harlem is changing. There's urban revitalization, there's gentrification. Okay, but the Puerto Ricans are moving somewhere. And as I looked into the literature, some of the other academic scholarship, newspaper articles, I realized more and more Puerto Ricans and Latinos more generally, they were moving south, okay, to places like Orlando, Florida, okay, places like North Carolina, Georgia, all of these other states, Tennessee, that have seen an influx within the last 2 decades in terms of their Latino population. So I followed the migration south and I moved to Orlando, Florida, to Greater Orlando, Osceola County in particular, okay, to try and document the transformations to the community and to document the history of migration in the area. Again, I had no intention of looking at foodways. I was thinking about Latinization and looking at, how the suburb became concentrated with Puerto Ricans, because that wasn't the initial history. So just to give you a sense of where Buenaventura Lakes is, again, I mentioned Osceola County, and if you see on the map Kissimmee, you can see that it's very, very close to a lot of places that could potentially provide employment, okay, for individuals that migrated to the region. Okay? But one of the other things I found out was that there was a lot of intentionality in terms of the migration of Puerto Ricans to Orlando, and in particular to Buenaventura Lakes. As I started to dig into the archives and look into the history, okay, I was fortunate to come in contact with people who had been part of the original stages of planning and development. And one of these newspaper articles, for instance, was shared with me, okay, from an archive, from someone who as an individual was collecting this history over the decades. Okay, but it turned out that these individuals, this consortium of individuals who were investors, real estate investors in Mexico, had decided to invest, okay, substantial amounts of money, okay, into Buenaventura Lakes. Okay, this was Landstar Homes at the time, which is why you see Mexican millionaires build city. Okay, Mickey Mouse gets neighbors. And initially, they marketed this community as this place of affordable luxury, a place where you can find country club living, you can have the Landstar lifestyle, okay? And of course, it appealed to individuals, okay? And they were very strategic, as I mentioned, in their planning, okay? They set up offices in Puerto Rico, okay? They had individuals recruiting in New York City and other areas where there were concentrations of Puerto Ricans and other Latinos. Okay. And this is over time, okay, that this happened. These particular ads you're seeing are from the late 70s, okay? They were in the early 80s. But that Puerto Rican migration didn't happen until decades later when there started to be a transformation, okay, in terms of who was coming and settling in the community, okay? Which is what brings me to foodways, okay, in particular. One of the things I was starting to look at in Buenaventura Lakes, okay, was Latinization, just looking for concentrations of people demographically, okay? But not only that, also seeing changes in the landscape, for instance, changes in the soundscape, okay? So when you go to a space, what do you hear? Do you hear people speaking Spanish, okay? Or is it English? Are you greeted in Spanish, okay? So I was looking for all these signs, okay, of cultural change, of transformation, okay? And food ended up being one of the very visible markers in terms of transformation. Okay, you had supermarkets like Public Sabor, okay, that were clearly trying to cater to a Latino population, okay, by having, for instance, not just one aisle, right, that's dedicated to international foods or to a Latino population, but in any given section, multiple brands that might be from Latin America represented. Okay. But this is where I started to learn a little bit more about the descent. Okay. One of the things I did, I conducted interviews, both formal and informal interviews with residents that were newer to the community, but also long-term residents, okay, that had been there for decades and that had really seen the transformation. Okay. And there was a demographic transformation from a primarily non-Hispanic or non-Latino white population, okay, to a primarily Latino population, with Puerto Ricans being the majority in terms of the Latinos, okay? So I became very interested, okay, in these spaces that were marking the landscape, okay, the place identity, the Latinization, okay, but through food. And when I started to talk to one particular group of individuals, long-term residents of the community of Buenaventura Lakes, they started talking about the supermarket in particular and their frustration at the supermarket, at being greeted in Spanish. They said the same thing happened to them when they would go to the bank. Okay, and they emphasized it's the Bank of America. Okay, they should be greeted in English. They felt the same way about the public savoir. And one of my key informants, actually, who had lived in the community for decades, went so far as to write a letter of complaint to the manager at Public Savoir. Okay, partly because he was disturbed when his brand of cheese was no longer being carried. Okay, and other Latin American brands, okay, were still on the shelves and perhaps had even replaced his brand. Okay, so again, this perception, okay, this response to migration, to transformation, and how food plays a part, okay, in terms of meaning, okay, in terms of who feels at home in a community or who feels like their community is changing in front of their face, before their eyes, okay, and all of a sudden they're feeling, at least some of my informants felt like they were now the outsiders in a community that they once felt comfortable, and they felt was home. Okay, and now they were greeted in a language where they didn't understand, okay, what was being said to them. And that caused a lot of dissent. Okay? So that was one of the things I was interested in. One of the other things was, again, food and how entrepreneurship, okay, became something important in the community and something that marked the visual landscape. So in the community where I was living, you would often see on weekends garage sales, okay, for example. Or yard sales, where people would actually maybe set up a grill on their front lawn, okay? And they would be cooking either skewers, which they call pinchos, okay, and selling them, okay? Or here, as you can see in the signs, alcapurrias, a fritter, okay, kind of a fried, wonderful morsel of goodness that you could just buy from somebody's home on a Saturday or Sunday. But I can remember certain residents being upset about this practice, okay, wondering if they were violating some kind of health codes, okay, wondering if it took the community's niceness to another level, if it didn't look nice. That, for instance, my neighbor would put his grill on the front lawn and put a few lawn chairs around, and that became his weekend business to make a little extra money. As cars came, right, parked, people sat, ate, came and gone throughout the day, okay? So you had this cycle of people, okay, cars parked, okay, consistently, that some residents didn't like. Okay, so again, food as marking the landscape, okay, the Latinization of the landscape, okay, being a part of cultural preservation, folks who migrated here, okay, who are making this food available to others, okay, but then also being something that can cause tension in the community. Another incident that I documented while I was doing research. This is also on the outside of Buenaventura Lakes. And it's a grocery store, but in the back of the grocery store, you can see there's hot food that's cooked and prepared there and sold. And there's tables where you can sit. And I would go there and just observe the interactions, would chat with the owner sometimes. He was from the Dominican Republic. And the food was Caribbean food, primarily Dominican food. And there was one incident when two gentlemen came in, okay, and they didn't speak Spanish, and they were trying to order oxtail, and they were trying to communicate with the woman behind the counter. And she didn't speak English, they didn't speak Spanish, and they kept trying to talk to her and ask her if the particular meat they were looking at was oxtail, and they were trying to order to go. And there were people, you know, sitting at the tables, and we all kind of stopped and looked and stared and eavesdropped a little bit. But it took a few minutes before someone actually stepped in to help and translate. But before that happened, those two gentlemen got a little bit upset, okay, and they started to get frustrated. And you know, one of them said, she just keeps going on and yapping away and talking. because for some reason, these gentlemen kept talking to her in English and she kept talking to them in Spanish, right? Realizing neither of them, of course, are understanding, but somehow hoping to communicate. And it took somebody to come and intervene and provide that translation so those gentlemen could order their food, their oxtail, and take that to go. Okay. So again, these moments of tension, but also a space where, you know what, that owner, okay, this woman behind the counter, they're acting as cultural brokers. Okay, they're perhaps introducing Caribbean cuisine, Dominican cuisine, okay, to individuals that are not familiar. Okay, where they were led to ask and inquire, is this oxtail? You know, what is this? Okay. And this all led me to think again about the significance of foodways. Okay. Certainly it became important, okay, when thinking about Latinization, this process of change. Okay. And it's a process of change where you can not only see things in the landscape, okay, but you also hear things in the soundscape. Okay. You suddenly see that maybe your children's school has changed demographic or population. Okay, all of a sudden, maybe report cards are being sent home, okay, in both Spanish and English. Okay, and that can cause dissent. Okay, and sometimes food enters and can tell you by studying foodways how people are responding, okay, to migration or perceiving individuals who have migrated. Okay. But at the same time, food in Orlando was so incredibly important to cultural preservation, okay, and also entrepreneurship. That was something I started to realize, that there was consistently new businesses popping up, okay? Not that they were always successful, but certainly they never ended, okay? In terms of businesses that provided some type of food that people would think of as authentic, okay? A food that maybe reminds them of back home on the island of Puerto Rico, okay, or of the Dominican Republic. So food was important, okay, in terms of cultural preservation. And I found it increasingly important when you were talking about later generations. So the second generation, the third generation, okay. So the children maybe didn't even speak Spanish anymore. They'd never been to Puerto Rico before. Okay, didn't keep in touch with family members on the island. Okay, but the food had passed along. Okay, the recipes had been preserved, or at least the love for the cuisine, even if they couldn't cook it themselves, it was expressed. So when I had interviews and I asked questions about people's identity, you know, what does it mean for you to be Puerto Rican? What does it mean to be Latino? Food constantly came up in discussion. Okay. And it would go back to grandmama's food, you know, my abuela's food, okay, what I grew up eating, and that giving you a sense of cultural identity, a sense of home, a connection to family, a connection to community. And again, that was so important, especially in second and third generation youth, okay, and even adults who, again, didn't necessarily grow up on the island, okay, immersed in the culture in the same way. Individuals who considered themselves Florida Ricans, or sometimes I even heard them referred to as Disney Ricans, okay? But individuals who were still preserving, okay, that culture through food, okay? And so I like to say also that these individuals who work in these industries are cultural brokers. Okay, they're also not only helping preserve culture for individuals who are maybe looking for that authentic meal, okay, but they're also introducing others, okay, to food and culture, okay, via food. And that brings me to the next project that I want to compare to Orlando. Okay. And I became interested in this project by very selfish means. I had moved to Mississippi, okay, after living in East Harlem, New York City, to accept a job at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. It's one of the only centers like that in the country, and I wanted to study the U.S. South. So it was the place to be, and I missed food from home. I missed food from East Harlem, the Puerto Rican cuisine I was used to. And so I went looking for restaurants, okay, where I could get something similar. Okay. And I didn't find exactly what I had in East Harlem, but I found similarities. I found similarities, other things that reminded me of home. But again, I started to realize there was a concentration of these businesses. And that's when I teamed up with the Southern Foodways Alliance. And they are an institute that's part of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi. And they focus on documenting foodways in the US South and the transformations, okay, surrounding foodways. And they celebrate food, okay, but they also think about food critically. And so I teamed up with them to do an oral history project where we were just going to do interviews with different individuals that were either restaurant owners or managers and individuals that identified as Latino, okay, or Latina in some type of way. Okay. And they weren't necessarily first generation. They could have been third generation. Sometimes it was the children of the owners that we interviewed. Okay. But we wanted to understand their stories, their experiences, okay, and the role that food was playing in their life. So you can see here two women that own a restaurant, a Colombian restaurant. I should say Colombian and Mexican though. It's called Mi Tierra. Okay. And initially it was Colombian food. One of the women is from Colombia. The other one is Guatemalan. And initially their intention was only to serve Colombian food, but they realized that they were having a hard time with their customer base. Okay. And this place is located in Memphis, Tennessee. Okay. And they realized it was because there was a lack of familiarity with Colombian food. And so they added Mexican food to their menu, and they offer both. They have multiple menus and you can choose which one. Okay. But they're serving as cultural brokers, okay, where they're introducing a population that's not familiar with Colombian food, that's willing to walk in there because they maybe like Mexican or no Mexican food, are more familiar just based on the popularity of the cuisine and the concentration of restaurants, right? Whereas you don't see the same for Colombian food. Okay, so they're serving as cultural brokers and introducing a population, okay, to Colombian food by presenting it at least on the menu, giving them the option of trying something new, okay, while still being strategic in terms of entrepreneurship and keeping their business alive and afloat, okay, for decades now. And here you can see, okay, the interior of that particular space and place, okay, where they've tried to create a place identity, okay, where you walk in and you're transplanted, you're transported, okay, back to perhaps Colombia. Although this is, again, their construction of it in terms of the art they've chosen, okay, and the memorabilia. Another restaurant, and this is one that didn't make it, okay, that was on a particular area, commercial strip called Summer Avenue, and that's where I'm really focusing my documentary research now, okay, and this was an individual whose family was kind of decided they wanted to open a business, and they had cooked all their lives, and they hadn't owned a business or a restaurant before. But they wanted to try their hand at it, and they were specializing in Venezuelan food. Okay, but they had a lot of challenges. Okay, in terms of keeping the service fast enough. Okay, in terms of people being willing to try Venezuelan cuisine. Okay, when they were not familiar with, say, arepas. Okay, and some of the other wonderful things that they offered on the menu. Okay. La Herradura was another place. Again, these are all on Summer Avenue, just to give you some visuals, okay? But it's, again, a commercial strip, and a commercial strip that has gone through a lot of transformation over the years. And one of the things I want to think about is, again, the importance of food. Okay, so on Summer Avenue, and this was a few years ago, there was a linguistic landscape study that was done. Okay. And people were taken on walking tours and asked these interview questions while they were actually, looking at spaces and places. Okay. And in particular, they were looking at businesses that had foreign language signage. Okay. And they were being asked, about their willingness to go into these spaces and places, okay, to interact or to buy products from a store that they could tell maybe by the language was owned, right, or often patronized by individuals that had maybe migrated from somewhere else. Okay, so on this kind of linguistic landscape study, one of the questions individuals were asked was if they go into stores and shops that advertise in languages other than English. Okay, and one of the responses was, it depends. Okay, if I'm looking for car maintenance to buy some item and the description is written only in Spanish, it doesn't make sense to me. Unless there is no other option, I don't go there. But if I want to eat Mexican food and the sign is written in Hispanica, I'm assuming they meant Spanish, it doesn't matter to me. Okay. Another response to the same question. No, I don't necessarily. Outside of restaurants. Okay, again, just be attentive how often people are mentioning food or restaurants or markets. Okay. They go on, I wouldn't be shopping at a Hispanic place. It seems like a very market specific retailer. So they're reaching their market and perhaps I'm not one of them. Okay. Another person. I've actually, at first, I wouldn't. And then, like I said, the economic incentives, because the things are cheaper there. Yeah, I go in. It's like people are learning to go to Hispanic grocery stores because of the difference in price. Another individual. If I don't know what it is, I don't want to go in there unless it's a restaurant. Another response. Probably not. If I don't know what language it is or don't know what it says, I would be more than hesitant to enter in a store like that. And not because there's necessarily bad things in there, just because I don't know exactly what I'd be getting into. If there's something specific I might need from a Spanish market like that, I would. Okay. So again, I wanted to read you those responses. Okay, so you can see that hesitation to go into spaces and places. Okay, at least in this landscape study on Summer Avenue. Okay, and the exception. Okay, and this was consistent throughout this report. Okay, throughout the research, throughout the responses to those interview questions. Okay, consistently, people were willing. Okay, were more open-minded about entering a place, having an interaction with the migrant population. Okay, if food was involved. Okay, if it was a market, if it was a restaurant. Okay, no matter what the signage said, okay, in terms of the business itself. Okay. And that's really, really important. And it's become really important on Summer Avenue in Memphis. Okay, because there's an initiative that started with the Summer Avenue Merchants Association, where they tried to brand Summer Avenue as Memphis's first international district. Okay, and that's because there's this concentration of restaurants. Okay, and a lot of them are Mexican restaurants, but you can also find Colombian. Okay, you can find food from Yemen. Okay, you can find Palestinian food, Vietnamese, Thai. So it really is international. Okay, although the community surrounding it is certainly concentrated with Latinos. Okay, but this Merchants Association, okay, had some partnerships with marketing firms and realized that, you know what, strategically, okay, we can create a sense of place here. We can work on urban revitalization. We can work on making this a place that is a destination in Memphis. If we emphasize, okay, the foodways, if we emphasize, okay, that there's all this representation of different countries and different people via food. Okay, so what I found was something very, very different happening, okay, in terms of the response to the influx and the demographic change in comparison to what I was finding in Orlando, where, of course, you know, this maybe was the exception that some of the people I interviewed felt very tense and hostile, okay, about transformations and changes. And you do have people who are very open-minded, certainly in Florida, about transformation and trying new foods, okay, and transformations to their own community, right, and embracing that. And in Memphis, it seemed like that was truly what was happening, okay, although there ended up still being some dissent. Okay, and that dissent stemmed from within the Latino population, which is what initially struck me. Okay, because on the surface, it looked to me like, you know, this Merchants Association. Okay, and I've interviewed the president of the association. They've been incredibly helpful in my documentary research. Okay, and in their mind, they were embracing diversity and this was celebrating culture. You can see they even went so far as receiving a grant and putting flags up, okay, on the polls to represent different nation states. But the response from one individual in the Latino community, and this was echoed, okay, was that it is potentially threatening, that it can lead to gentrification, for example, okay, or a greater policing of the migrant population. And the question was, who is this really going to benefit? Okay. Is it going to benefit the individuals that live in the community in any type of way? Or are we just using them and branding, okay, this space and place, okay, to the benefit of others, where eventually maybe they won't even be able to afford, okay, to rent those that real estate and afford those leases? Because in my interviews, a lot of the individuals explained that it was very affordable to be on Summer Avenue in comparison to other spaces and places. Okay, so there was this tension again, okay, that arose over this attempt to celebrate food and culture, okay, that I wasn't necessarily anticipating. And part of that, okay, became clearer to me as I dug back. Again, the archives become so important in my research because it helps me understand what a place was like, okay, historically, how people imagine that space and place. Okay. And so Summer Avenue, at one point here, you can see, okay, they have these costly new shopping centers that are opening, festivities planned. Okay. And this is in the 50s, where they're talking about having a helicopter and Santa Claus appearance and all types of prizes. Okay. Just to highlight, okay, that this was really a hub. Okay. This is Summer Avenue is the location of the first Holiday Inn, okay, in the United States, the location of the first McDonald's in Memphis, Tennessee. Okay. It was really a hub. It was a hub for travel, for transportation. Okay. You would find hotels, concentrated fast food restaurants. Okay. As I went through the archive, I found that it was this eclectic space. Okay. And these are just ads from the 80s where you can see, okay, they're talking about barbecue pizza at an Italian restaurant. Okay. They had advertisements for Steinmart, okay, one of these higher end stores for retail. Okay. And then it also went through this decline, okay, which is where the Latino population and the international community becomes so important. Okay. At one point, Summer Avenue started to take what some see and explained and articulated to me as a decline. And they saw that decline resulting from desegregation in Memphis. So all of a sudden, the schools were desegregated, okay? And as a result, you had white flight. Okay? So you had individuals who decided to leave the community that surrounded Summer Avenue. And you had a lot of blight as a result. You had less investment in the community. Some of those high-end stores started to shut down. They moved elsewhere. Okay? You had increases in crime, and you had things like prostitution and robberies and assaults, and people would talk about the place identity in a very negative light, negative perceptions. They would talk about all the youth, okay, hanging out in parking lots, what you can see here, okay, in this photograph. Okay, so there was this decline, but then all of a sudden, okay, there was demographic changes that happened in Memphis. Okay. No different than what I saw in Orlando, okay, where all of a sudden in the US South, there was an influx of Latinos, okay, into communities that were new destinations for migrants, okay. In Florida, of course, you had an influx in Miami, South Florida, right? Even in Orlando, you have a history of migration. But what was different, what was unique was the size, okay, the percentage of change and growth. It was that growth and change and that move was happening so rapidly, so quickly. It felt like communities were changing overnight to some people. I remember looking at statistics and demographic data, just to give you an example, in Osceola County, okay, in Buenaventura Lakes. And at one point, you would see that it was about 2% Hispanic. And then you fast forward to the contemporary moment, and it was over 50%. Okay. For some individuals from the 80s, being some of the first residents in these communities and seeing it be 2% Hispanic and Spanish language almost never spoken, to all of a sudden a transformation in the contemporary period, okay, where, what you see and what you hear feels like it could perhaps be somewhere foreign. Okay, some of my interviewees would certainly articulate. Okay, but it certainly had maybe what they would describe as a different vibe, a different feeling, okay, because of that Latinization, that internationalization to the place and to the space. Okay. So again, that leads to tensions, okay, because some of the spaces and places that people remember, okay, the places that people are nostalgic about, okay, have transformed. And sometimes the new food, the new restaurants that are available, okay, that are introduced, really help signal transformation from demographic change and migration. Okay, so again, I challenge you to think about your own thoughts, your own feelings, okay, about food, whether or not food is something you embrace, okay? Whether or not food is something that is a window into another culture for you, okay? As a cultural anthropologist, it certainly has been for me, okay? Food has been a way that I can communicate with people when there are linguistic barriers, okay? But they can show their appreciation, okay, perhaps through a meal or by preparing a meal, okay? And what I want to show you right now, it's a very, very short clip. It's about 2 minutes long. But at the Southern Foodways Alliance, again, I mentioned that I partner with them. And what we try and do is document, okay, through sound, through visuals, through interviews, especially oral history interviews, okay, transformation, change, okay. And this is one of the short clips, okay, just a clip that one of our new filmmakers put together when we collaborated on a project for a museum to kind of emphasize migration and movement and what's happening in the US South, okay, in terms of spaces and places. And there's one very important young lady in this clip, okay, who talks about, you know, what it means to her for this to be embraced.
I feel like each culture has their own type of food. Like people have American people can come up in here and they go like they ask for us for like Mexican sauces and stuff like that, and that kind of makes me feel proud because they're like, oh, I'm like, oh, they like our culture, they like our food, and I feel like that's important so people can like try different kinds of foods of like different kind of places, like Colombian food, Honduran food, Mexican food.
Okay. So the last things that I'd like to leave you with before we go to Q&A are really two remarks. And these are from Anthony Bourdain, the late Anthony Bourdain, chef, food writer. And these are transcripts that were archived online from a PBS NewsHour online interview he did. And two of the things he said were just really powerful and have stuck with me. One of the things he says is, yes, food may not be the answer to world peace, but it's a start. Okay? And he goes on to say, okay, all of my relationships with people around the world begin when I express an interest and a willingness to respect their traditions behind what they put on my plate. with that, I want to end there and open it to questions that you might have.
I love the presentation. I know when you were talking about the grocery store, I know my Italian great grandparents had a grocer as well in Louisiana, and I wish I was able to talk to them or somebody who kind of knew the store to see what all they sold and everything.
Yes, they have such rich histories in terms of stores and grocers, and they end up
Yeah,
in a social space too sometimes where people come and talk and they end up knowing everyone in the community. So it's really interesting.
yeah. Um, I know you were talking about the openness of people going into grocery stores and trying things out. Do you think another way of positivity is some of these like food challenges that YouTubers or TikTokers are doing of getting a box from a country and then trying that food? You think that's opening up some foodways cultures to for people to try out things?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, any of these new, I mean, I'm thinking even of things like HelloFresh and these
Mhm.
different boxes that people can now order, and they have international meals that are part of the kits.
Oh, that's nice. I didn't know that.
Some of them do, yes, and you can pick. So obviously it's up to you to try Mediterranean, chicken with couscous or not, because they give options. But I've seen and I've heard people talk about that where they're trying different things, like they're making a Thai chicken on their own because it comes in the meal kit, and they would never think to do that themselves. Part of I think part of the challenge is just the ingredients themselves. Getting the ingredients you would need, and maybe having to go to a specialty market if you're going to make something from scratch and do it the right way. But if they're doing it for you in a meal kit, or you're getting creative with it in other types of
Yeah.
ways, I think it really does open the door for people to then maybe be curious about people and go deeper than food. So it's like, I love food because when you talk about food, people lean in. And when you talk about, inequalities or the social construction of race and labor issues, people are just kind of like, oh, but with food, you lean in and you can still get at all those issues
Yeah.
through food. So, yeah, I think food can be so powerful in that type of way. And there's a lot of doors to be open with social media and all these new ways in which how we can explore.
Okay. Like I said, with my family, they had a grocery store, and my mom is Cajun, and I know she tries to teach us the ways of like red beans and rice and gumbo and all of that. But I don't have, I mean, I know she does represent or try and represent, of course, the Italian side of my dad, but she wasn't from that family. So it kind of skipped a generation or two. So is there a way of getting that food culture kind of back if it's skipped or anything? Like, say, I want to go dive into my Italian side. Is there a way for anybody to find a way through food culture back in their generations?
I think you're going to have to do it with a lot of intentionality because it's a challenge. I
Mhm.
think it would take reaching out to maybe family members if they're there, if you even have
Right.
access, to older generations that maybe still have the recipes, and maybe if they don't make it anymore, they still know the recipe. So they can pass it down and pass that knowledge down, even if they don't do it anymore. They might have a recipe book saved, that they could pass along. So I think that's the first thing, contacting family, uh, maybe people within the family's networks of the same ethnicity or ethnic identity that might know some of that. The other thing to do is the research and exploration in terms of cookbooks, seeing what's out there in terms of cookbooks, or other scholarship that might be written about, say, Italian cuisine. But I would say cookbooks would be the way to go, where you can maybe try to learn from other individuals how to make things. And of course, you wouldn't want these fusion cookbooks or because there's a lot of transformation too that is introduced if you're looking for authentic.
Right.
But I definitely say family if there's anybody still, and before it's too late. That's the other
Yeah.
thing. Especially, there's a lot of research that I've read about on the Jewish community in Natchez, and in Mississippi. And it's been really interesting to me because the food culture is something that's not being passed along, because when people come of age, they don't want to stay in Natchez, Mississippi. They move away. And so the young folk aren't having that sense of community. And so they're not having those events anymore, where you would eat, the foods and pass along that knowledge. So recipe books and cookbooks have, I think, become more and more important in families. But social media might be another way too. Now that we can, video chat and do all these things, it's a lot easier for someone to walk you through the process of cooking and preparing something.
That's true. Just get on Zoom and have a
Yeah.
cooking.
And YouTube is amazing, for what you can now find in terms of recipes and other things like that people now want to share, and are willing to share what used to be like a family secret or a family recipe. So that access, but it's really hard, I think, for third generations and later generations, or when it skips a generation, to get that access.
Yeah. And do you think another kind of hard point would be when you have to alter recipes for dietary restrictions now, or we're learning now that the food back then may have not been so healthy for us, so we have to kind of cut back on, like, put leaner meats instead of the heavier meats and all of that? Does that lose any of the food culture itself when you change it that way, or do you think is it still the same type of food culture, or is it just going to get lost and just changed over time?
That's a good question. That's a really good question, because again, I'm thinking back to the Jewish population where, they couldn't get foods that were kosher. And so, they adapted and they started eating non-kosher foods. And that for Southern Jews became, a lot more prevalent in terms of what they were eating because of the space and place they found themselves in and because of access. So the food culture, became more hybrid, where it might just be on special occasions, that you had different silverware to not mix, but yeah, I think that eventually, yes, some things might change. I mean, dietary restrictions, we certainly are more conscious and health conscious. So I think also, people aren't preparing those heavy meals as often as maybe, it was being done generations ago. So I do think, just over time, there will be some transformations, that'll be inevitable. But for the most part, I think if you're passing the recipes down, you're preserving that culture in some respect, as long as you can still get the ingredients, which has been a challenge I found for some folks, especially if you're the first to migrate to a space or place, especially in the South. You're the newcomers. They don't already have the international market where you can find what you need. So, your kids don't grow up eating that food because you don't have access to the, particular ingredients you might need.
True. Or even with COVID and everything,
Oh,
shipping
yes.
was weird on all accounts. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even more so if you were isolated.
You were mentioning something about like having the big groups of having food and everything. I know I myself have gone to Greek Fest from Greek Orthodox churches and everything. Do you think we should have more of those type of things to represent different communities? Like not per saying at churches, but of
Oh,
just those type of
absolutely.
festivals.
Absolutely. I think they're wonderful. I think they're a wonderful way to not only bring community members together, just in general, because I don't think, well, obviously after COVID, there's going to be even more need for socialization because so many people have been isolated for so long, especially kids and in terms of their education. But no, I think food festivals are just a brilliant way to bring community members together and expose people to other cultures, because we all have to eat, so there's this basic fundamental human need, surrounding food, but then it's also pleasure for people. When you taste something delicious, and it's something new, even more excitement. You've just discovered something and you've just got a taste of somebody else's culture. And that's maybe a conversation you can have, or with someone you meet later on because you're familiar. Or maybe it means because you went to that food festival and you tried, I don't know, a Thai dumpling or something, you're willing to perhaps, go further next time and try a little bit more and then venture to another restaurant and maybe make it a hobby. But yeah, I think food festivals are a great way to expose people to different cultures simultaneously too, especially if there's, strategic booths and things like that representing different countries.
Yeah, I know that's one reason why Epcot's one of my favorite. I get to try different foods from everywhere without having to travel the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's also really important for entrepreneurship, for those folks that are actually running those food stands. A lot of the folks I've interviewed, that's how they got started with food trucks or, selling from home or selling to friends. And then just with that aspiration building up till they finally had the business. But I think those festivals give people a good opportunity also for entrepreneurship and for growth.
Got you. So you don't think that it would be, because you had touched something about how somebody had gotten a grant and they were doing this big festival thing, that it was almost worrisome that they may start upcharging or taking away that culture. So there's kind of a balance of what should be acceptable and such.
I agree. I think there's a balance. I think a lot of it, of course, the intentions of the people matter. But also, I think there's a way of communicating with the community so that equity piece is there. So you realize you're not just taking from the folks. You're trying to give back in some kind of way or being conscious. So if you're going to brand, an area as the international district, it's pretty important to notify the people who maybe contribute to that international culture of what you're trying to do. So I think in some ways there might have even been miscommunication, or explaining what that means, or maybe in the process of doing that, showing how you're going to do outreach to the youth in the same process of branding by doing a food festival. Do you know what I mean? So it's not just, hey, come here to this space and place, go to these, international restaurants, let's pump money into this place so more folks will come. What are we also doing for the communities? So I think that, and the other fear, and when a lot of that discussion was happening was when there were a lot of ICE raids. So the fear was also that, are we making these individuals an easy target? Because now everyone knows all the international folks are concentrated in these communities. So does it mean that the police are going to come in larger numbers and be, more weary and looking for people who, and racial profiling folks? So I think that was also a fear, does branding really help, and who does it help?
Got you.
So yeah, there's a tension there. So it's that fine line. I think open communication is the best way, and to have community partners.
Yeah.
So that, it's not just the folks on the top making the decisions and doing all this, but, working with the people on the ground to say, hey, what do you need? What do you think? You have a voice too.
Okay. What do you think of places that have I know Boston has like Little Italy or stuff of that nature. Do you think we should still have those type of towns that still represent our culture? Or do you think that's another hub where it could get targeted?
I grew up in Spanish Harlem. So for me, it was a beautiful thing. Like I loved growing up there because I felt the preservation of culture, because I had my family there, because people look like me. And I remember that specifically as a kid because we moved when I was in middle school to Delaware, to the suburbs where it was a black-white racial binary. There was no Latino, population in the mix. And I had moved from a place where it was, concentrated with Latinos and where I looked like everyone else. And I remember that being very jarring where, it felt nice to be in a space and place where people look like you, or where you can get food that was familiar and that, reminded you of home or your parents of the island they came from. So I love those spaces and places. I really do. I think they're important for the community members who settle there. And I think they tend to be a place where people who are first migrating will maybe look, to settle, because there's already a community maybe that speaks Spanish and will help, make that transition easier to a community. I can think of that certainly in Orlando. That's why people would tell me they went to Buenaventura Lakes, in Osceola County, they were looking for spaces where there were other Puerto Ricans and their Puerto Rican food and music. So they would feel like they're still at home, and have a taste of home, but have a new life at the same time and contribute to a new space and place. So yeah, I like those spaces and places that are, they call them ethnic enclaves sometimes, but I can see too how, depending on how they're marketed, it ends up, you're selling the culture in some ways.
Yeah.
And you have to sell it and market it if you want to make money. So, there's no win. There's no win. It's kind of a fine line. It's a fine line, but I think it has a lot of important contributions and functions for the immigrant community.
Okay. A little bit of another hard-hitting question. I saw in the news fairly months ago about one of the Kardashians doing a tequila company or a tequila brand. Do you think that food or drinks in this situation is sacred to just that culture? Or because I know there was a big, push and pull of like, should she even have a tequila company if she's not from that culture, especially with what she named it as well. But or do you think that people in marketing can just coexist together in that form?
That's a hard one. It's really hard because I can't imagine, certain foods being limited to certain people only in certain cultures. If you're a chef and you have a love for French food, and you want to specialize in French food and open a French restaurant, and you are not from France, I just can't imagine telling someone, no, you cannot follow that passion and dream, and you cannot cook this food, or even questioning the authenticity of that food, because of the person's background. It feels very problematic to me in ways where you would think only people, because then the question becomes, well, who gets the right to claim that food? Do I, that third generation Puerto Rican that's never actually lived on the island, get to claim, you know what I mean, this food is my own, even though I'm probably more Americanized than some folks that would see me as foreign. I tend to be more open-minded. I think there's a way of doing it respectfully, certainly. Because I know, there's certainly a lot of critique of cultural appropriation and things of that nature. So I think there's a way of doing it respectfully, maybe telling the history as part of your branding of where this comes from. If you're passionate about this, tell your story, so people realize you're not just exploiting or taking advantage of your fame and wealth and not even thinking critically about what you're doing for the name, for instance.
So one of the last questions we'll have would be, what's your favorite types of food to eat, or what's your favorite dishes?
Oh my goodness. Where do I start? I love pastelas. Puerto Rican pastelas is one thing I really love. And that's because we only could have it around Christmas time or New Year's, that my grandmother would make it. So because it was so rare that I could have it, it was just one of those things that I loved. So yeah, the things that I don't know how to make myself and the things that were harder for me to come by tend to be the ones that stuck with me from my childhood. So that would be one of my favorites.
Okay. And I know you mentioned like you can't make it, or maybe you don't have time to make it. Do you think we all should take some time and learn to cook to keep these foodways going?
Absolutely. Even if it's one recipe, even if it's just one family recipe, that you perfect and can pass on. Because if enough people within a family do that, you're going to preserve quite a few. But I absolutely am behind, learning how to cook and experimenting, even if it becomes your little fusion, trying to preserve that though, or doing that through recipes is really important. And that's been important in my family, where my mother made my grandmother write down recipes for her, and then my mother gave them to me. And so I now have them, even though I don't cook them very often, if ever. I have them if I want to, I know I can, and I can pass that down.
Yeah.
One day. So it's nice to have that in your family as a history, really.
That's true. I know for me, whenever my mom gives me a recipe, I'm like, this somehow still doesn't taste like yours.
Oh yes, never does. Never quite as good. Never quite as good.
It never is. It's those secret things that even when I'm watching her make it, there was one time I watched her make it and I'm like, I must have blinked or turned around for like 1 second and you added something.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. That happens to me all the time. Whether it's the consistency or the flavor, it just, something doesn't always turn out the way the elders make it.
Right. I think it's probably that wooden spoon or that pot that was probably seasoned or something all the time.
Okay. Oh yes, I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Well, thank you so much for doing this talk. I know we've all learned a lot, and I hope to be working with you in the future, maybe.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to share my research with you and talk about food, my favorite.
And now everyone can go and get some dinner since we're all probably hungry now.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. Well, thank you.
Thank you, and everyone have a good night. Bye.